Dear friends, I don't need to tell you that the coronavirus pandemic has inflicted terrible damage to many countries all over the world in 2020. I'm not going to tell you that the virus has spread through Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, nor that a lot of governments, including those of developed countries such as Spain, the United States, or the United Kingdom, have provided sad and bungling responses. I won't try to explain what SARS coronavirus 2 is either. I'm not going to do any of these things because you already know all of this. In this video, we are going to focus on Argentina, a country that is not only suffering the scourge of the coronavirus, but is also caught in a perfect storm: a pandemic, an economic crisis, a loan default, and a political confrontation.
De acá no se va a mover nadie, porque de acá tenemos que irnos con una solución. Ese es definitivamente es la voz de todo el personal que está aquí. Una solución. Y la solución es ir con un sueldo básico de un 56% de aumento.
Digo esto y digo que también soy sensible al reclamo de esos policías, porque está claro que han quedado atrasados en sus salarios y que hay que darles una respuesta, pero no vamos a aceptar que sigan con este modo de protesta.
This is serious, even for Argentina, the country that has made crises a mark of identity, its most defining feature, almost a tourist attraction. Do you want to see a crisis firsthand? The true effects of devaluation, maybe even hyperinflation? Don't delay, visit Argentina today. We're currently offering a 2 for the price of 1 deal. Well, friends, unfortunately, even for a country so experienced in dealing with financial crises, this particular perfect storm may already be too much. But let's start all the way at the beginning. Let's go back to March 2020.
Hemos tomado una decisión en el gobierno nacional, que es dictar un decreto de necesidad y urgencia. Por ese decreto, a toda la Argentina, a todos los argentinos, a todas las argentinas, a partir de las 0 horas de mañana, deberán someterse al aislamiento social preventivo y obligatorio. Esto quiere decir que a partir de ese momento nadie puede moverse de su residencia. Todos tienen que quedarse en sus casas.
At that time, news about the spread of the virus through Asia and Europe led the government of Alberto Fernández to decree a strict quarantine on March 20th. The official term used was preventative and obligatory social isolation. The quarantine established an almost total closure of the country for 2 weeks. Upon its enforcement, all activities were suspended except for essential activities related to medical services and the distribution and sale of food. All other businesses had to be closed, and the Argentinians had to stay at home. The airports were also closed, as well as all land and sea borders. To contain the arrival of the coronavirus, Argentina, like many other countries, went into hibernation mode. Friends, from that moment on, things changed almost completely. The use of masks became the norm. Trains and buses travelled almost without passengers, and the city streets looked like those of an uninhabited town in the Wild West. And the surprising thing is that this prompt and energetic response made the popularity of the president Alberto Fernández soar. In a country historically divided at political level, his approval ratings were close to 85%.
Los argentinos necesitamos que aparezca un virus que nos una.
However, hold on a moment, because this is far from the end of the story. Little by little, the enthusiasm and the new normal lost steam as the quarantine was extended again and again and again every 15 days. And since then, yes, some things have changed. The strict quarantine has been exchanged for strict social distancing and containment measures. The terms, the obligations have been modified. But the truth is that almost 6 months on from that March 20th decree, Argentina is still far from normal. And it's not all due to the pandemic, because as you all know, we are not talking about just any country. Such long and severe quarantine containment measures would have a terrible effect on the economy of any country in the world. But in Argentina's case, it's even worse. Why? Because even before the pandemic, the Argentine economy was in a critical state. So you can imagine how bad, I'm talking really bad, things look right now. So why is it that the quarantines and the extreme confinement of the country have been extended for so long? Why do the results seem so dire despite all the effort? What has been the true impact of this pandemic on the Argentine economy and political landscape? Listen up.
En común acuerdo con los gobernadores, tomamos la decisión de prorrogar las medidas de cuidado, el aislamiento sanitario, el distanciamiento físico, hasta el próximo 20 de septiembre.
An incomplete strategy.
On 20th of March, the government of Alberto Fernández declared a strict quarantine, seeking the cooperation of the citizens themselves to enforce it. For example, an official telephone number was created, 134, to which any Argentine could call and report anyone who is not complying with the mandatory confinement and the measures decreed to deal with the pandemic.
Por eso te pedimos, si sabes de alguien que no está respetando el aislamiento obligatorio o de casos de abusos por parte de la fuerza de seguridad, llama al 134 y denuncia.
Also, a strong media campaign was launched to make people aware of the dangers that this virus could bring. This virus was presented as a silent killer, a mass murderer, raging out of control, the invisible enemy.
Yo siento que estamos luchando contra un enemigo invisible, que de repente anida en alguno de nosotros y nos convierte a nosotros en enfermos y en portadores del enemigo.
The goal was to raise awareness among all Argentinians so that they would take the fight against the coronavirus as seriously as if the virus were an invading country. In this way, citizens would comply with the harsh measures of confinement and social distancing. Measures such as having to stay at home at all times except to perform essential activities. This nipped mobility between provinces in the bud. And even after the worst part of the quarantine was over, citizens still needed to carry special permits and authorizations to be able to circulate in many places in the country, such as the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires itself. As far as aviation and international travel goes, let's not even talk about it. Because friends, Argentina is one of the few countries where no air connections have been resumed. In fact, if we take a look, for example, at the flight radar app, we are going to find a very unusual situation. Little by little, planes are beginning to take to the skies, except in Argentina, where they've practically just disappeared. If we talk about measures, they established some pretty controversial ones. For example, releasing lots of prisoners and quarantining them in their homes to prevent them from becoming sources of contagion within the prisons. A measure that was put in place following the recommendations of the UN and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, but which has been very controversial, particularly because there have been many known cases of prisoners sentenced for serious crimes, such as murder or rape, who have managed to get released from the prison on this scheme. And whether or not it's a contributing factor, because the most important variable is probably the increase in poverty. The truth is that in recent months, there has been an apparent increase in crime.
The rise of insecurity, the new phase of the eternal quarantine. La Nación. Coronavirus. Killers and abusers were released from prison because of the pandemic. La Nación.
The point is that, as you can see, Alberto Fernández's government has been very assertive in the fight against this pandemic right from the beginning. Wouldn't you agree? Well, wait a minute, because there is something wrong. Take a look at this.
The number of coronavirus deaths has doubled in the last 3 weeks, and Argentina will reach 10,000 deaths after 170 days of quarantine. Infobae.
In spite of almost 6 months of quarantine and strict measures of social confinement and distancing, as you can see in this graph, the curve of new cases has not let up. And so the logical question we have to ask ourselves is, what the hell is going wrong in Argentina? Well, friends, pay attention to news like this.
Coronavirus. Argentina could only test more than Bolivia, Ecuador, Guyana, and Suriname in the region. Clarín.
Bolivia, Guyana, and Suriname? Is this some kind of joke? Isn't Argentina supposed to be a much richer and more developed country? Well, to give you an idea, there is not a single country in Europe that does not exceed the number of tests per million carried out in Argentina. Not a single one. Not even those that have been hardly hit by the pandemic. Let's just say that Argentine values are closer to Africa than to the old continent. And take note, because one of the strategies shared by the countries that have the best results against the coronavirus has been to apply the strategy test, test, test. This is the way you can identify infected people and isolate them to prevent them from infecting others.
Y la verdad es que yo no sé cómo esto funciona en el mundo, pero siempre había escuchado hablar de los test rápidos, y los test rápidos son los test seriológicos que se llaman, pero no existía un test rápido para conocer si uno está infectado o no. Y la verdad es que estoy feliz que lo hayan hecho científicos argentinos.
Testing and tracking are two elements that are proving indispensable in overcoming this crisis. However, Argentina has opted for a different strategy. The government of Alberto Fernández has bet practically everything on quarantine measures. The problem? Well, as time goes by, the measures of restriction, quarantine, and social distancing are losing their effect. Let's say, as time goes by, either out of economic necessity, exhaustion, or low morale, people eventually leave their homes and return to their normal lives. In fact, this is exactly what happened in Argentina very quickly. After the first weeks of strict confinement, full compliance with the rules became less and less the norm. But don't just take our word for it, it's what President Fernández himself says.
August 13th, 2020. That they keep talking to me about quarantine is something that amazes me, because people are going out. The number of cases is increasing because circulation is increasing, because the care that we permanently ask for does not exist. Alberto Fernández, President of the Argentine Republic.
With few tests and little ability to track and follow up on positive cases, it is very complicated, if not impossible, to deal with this pandemic. That, at least, is what the data says.
Y sé que a los adolescentes les cuesta mucho estar en sus casas, pero hay que tener inventiva, usar la imaginación de los adolescentes. Es un tiempo también para que pienses. Yo cuento con vos. Cuídate.
It is true that, for the time being, Argentina has managed to have, thanks to those measures, a lower fatality rate than other countries. This is partly because the evolution of the pandemic here has been slower. And with the coronavirus, when the spread is very fast, it is the overloading of hospitals that is one of the causes of the multiplication of death rates. But if cases continue to rise like this in Argentina, we may see more problems. On the other hand, we cannot forget the economic effect of such an extended period of quarantine, social confinement, and distancing measures. Friends, Argentina's economy has been in a more profound hibernation than any other country. And of course, we are talking about Argentina, a country whose foundations were not exactly solid before the pandemic. And you probably know this very well because we have talked about it often on VisualPolitik. The country itself was going through almost 2 years of recession and was facing unpayable debt and runaway inflation long before Fernández decreed the quarantine. And since then, things have only gotten worse. Argentina is experiencing a greater economic downturn than the crisis of 2001 to 2002, the worst economic disaster in its history so far. According to the Argentinian Chamber of Commerce and Services, more than 42,000 small and medium-sized companies have closed or are about to close. In May, the country announced its umpteenth default. Then, according to the Ministry of Labour, almost 2 million face a very complicated employment scenario in which their jobs are suspended. This is approximately 1 out of 8 private sector jobs. And given that the government has to resort to the central bank for financing, it is not hard to imagine that when things begin to normalize, the country may even face a scenario of hyperinflation. All of this explains why ECLAC, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, estimates that poverty will affect nearly 40% of the population by the end of the year. Friends, the situation in Argentina is beginning to be so extreme that a spike in cases of depression and anxiety at crisis level has already been detected.
At the beginning of the quarantine, 6 out of 10 Argentines had mild, moderate, or severe symptoms of anxiety. Over the course of days, these symptoms remained, but the anguish turned into depression. We are seeing an epidemic of mental illness. Today, we Argentines are exhausted. Facundo Manes.
And this is not all to do with the political, social, and economic backdrop in the Land of Tango. There is another point that is also very controversial: the way the pandemic has been co-opted for ideological goals. Let me explain. The Fernández government and many unions, especially those of civil servants, have wanted to get a piece of the action. You know, and if you don't, I'll tell you, that in Argentina, even soup is political, and this event was no different. The Argentinian government and its allies did something that should never be done in this type of crisis. They sought an electoral advantage at any price. In this case, a quick way to dump responsibilities and score an advantage for their political campaign. You see, after the general confinement was decreed, the government slogan was "The state is taking care of you," which already made its intentions clear. But they didn't stop there. Another idea that they tried to spread was that this pandemic showed the market was an enemy to be beaten, and some sectors of the government even described COVID-19 as a disease that could be blamed on the rich, because of course, they said that by traveling abroad, they had to have brought it back with them.
En este tipo de circunstancias extremas y críticas, el Estado es el que te cuida, no el mercado.
Un Estado presente en materia de salud es la mejor manera de cuidar a todos.
It is hard to believe that we are talking about Argentina, a country that was once one of the major players in world markets. In short, this is the price of low-cost populism. Economic crisis, political and social confrontation, potential hyperinflation in the making, and the feeling that the government has no plan for getting out of this hole. Friends, unfortunately, things in Argentina look worse than ever. From here, we have no other choice but to send good luck and a lot of encouragement to all of you who are watching us from Argentina. From all of the VisualPolitik team, our thoughts are with you. Argentina is a country that we think very highly of. Hopefully, we will soon be able to tell different stories about this country. And at this point, it's all over to you. What do you think Argentina should do to overcome this crisis? Leave us your answer in the comments, and if this video has been interesting for you, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Once again, thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.